What happens when an entire police force has to go up against a professor of criminology? The case we're looking at today isn't about a cunning criminal or a reckless killer. It's about a man who spent his entire career studying how criminals get caught. He stood at the front of lecture halls, teaching about crime scenes and evidence. He served as an advisor to both investigative agencies and prosecutors, and every year, he reviewed dozens of criminal case files. The answer lies in the case we're about to revisit together. It was a battle of wits that stretched on for months, every bit as gripping as anything Sherlock Holmes ever faced. Hello everyone, this is Crime Documentary Files. Our story begins in Busan, South Korea's largest port city, a place that immediately brings to mind the sea, crowded streets, and a forest of tightly packed high-rises. But travel west, toward the very edge of the city's administrative boundary, and the landscape changes completely. The tall buildings gradually thin out and disappear, leaving nothing ahead but vast stretches of water and tidal flats, extending all the way to the horizon. This is the Nakdong River estuary, where Ulsuk Bridge stretches across the water. A place so quiet that migratory birds choose it as a resting ground, and on most days, only a handful of fishing boats come and go. But don't let that peaceful surface fool you. Beneath the estuary, the currents are deep and turbulent, powerful enough to swallow a secret without anyone ever knowing. And then, on a day that seemed no different from any other, right along the water's edge, a heavy object had become lodged there, carrying something that was about to shake all of South Korea. On May 21st, 2011, Busan was already entering its hot and humid season. That day, a group of high school students had come to the area near Ulsuk Bridge for an environmental cleanup activity, an annual routine that had never given them anything worth remembering. They walked along the water's edge, picking up bottles, plastic bags, and other trash the river had washed ashore. Then one of the students stopped. Caught, there was a travel suitcase, its surface faded, its zipper so badly rusted that one glance was enough to tell it had been submerged for a long time. The suitcase was strangely bulging, and what caught the student's attention was its weight and the foul stench coming from it. Police arrived not long afterward, and when the zipper was opened right there on the riverbank, the people standing closest to it had to take several steps back. Inside was the body of a woman. She'd been tied up and weighed down with heavy objects, and after being submerged for so long, her body had become badly disfigured. Forensic investigators examined the body at the scene and issued a preliminary conclusion. The victim was a woman around 50 years old. There were clear ligature marks around her neck. The cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation, and the condition of the body indicated that she'd been underwater for at least a month. Investigators immediately took her fingerprints and compared them with the missing persons database, and the result came back very quickly. The victim was no stranger to the authorities. She was Mrs. Park, a female business owner who had mysteriously disappeared in Busan exactly 49 days earlier. Her disappearance had already kept the entire city talking for weeks. So when her identity was confirmed, the case immediately spread beyond Busan and became the focus of national attention. Mrs. Park had just turned 50 that year. She owned a well-known private exam preparation academy in Busan and earned a comfortable income. She was slender, always wore her short hair neatly styled, spoke politely, and had an open, generous manner. The kind of woman who had devoted nearly all her energy to her career. But her love life had never been as successful as the numbers in her business records. And at that age, she also hoped to find someone she could rely on as she grew older. Through a matchmaking introduction, she met a university professor surnamed Kang, who was a few years older than she was. On paper, there was almost nothing to criticize about him. He'd graduated from a prestigious university. He taught at a respected university in the Gyeongnam region. And most importantly, he was considered one of South Korea's leading experts in cybercrime. Outside the classroom, he also served as an advisory committee member for both the police and prosecutors, specializing in digital data forensics. Put simply, his job was to recover what criminals had deleted, leaving nowhere for crimes hidden behind a computer screen to escape. To outsiders, they seemed like a perfectly matched couple. Two middle-aged people who had found each other later in life and could finally lean on one another. On the surface, it sounded like a beautiful story. And yet, cracks began to appear far sooner than anyone could have imagined. There was one detail the public wouldn't learn until much later. Mrs. Park wasn't Professor Kang's first wife. She wasn't even his second. She was his fourth. He'd pursued her relentlessly before they married, and even then, people around them had already begun whispering that the professor hadn't approached her out of love, but because of the financial resources of a woman who ran a successful private academy. Not long after the wedding, Mrs. Park herself was stunned to discover that her husband's private life was nowhere near as spotless as the image he presented from behind the lectern. Even worse was the issue of money. From the very beginning of their marriage, Professor Kang had borrowed more than 300 million won from his wife, and then simply gone silent. Whenever she asked what the money had been used for, he flatly refused to explain. The couple argued constantly over matters like this, and by September 2010, just 6 months after their wedding, Mrs. Park moved back into her own home. They separated and eventually took their dispute to court. April 2nd, 2011, was the last day surveillance cameras ever recorded Mrs. Park. Before leaving home, she told her family that she was going to meet Professor Kang to settle the financial matters in their divorce. But somewhere along the way to meet her husband, she simply vanished. She never arrived, and she never came home. Her family kept calling but couldn't reach her, and panic quickly set in. Her younger brother immediately thought of his brother-in-law and called to find out what had happened, but no one answered. It wasn't until 3 days later, when he called again, that Professor Kang finally picked up. His answer was brief. He'd never met his wife, and perhaps she had simply left home and gone somewhere. Her family didn't believe him. They knew Mrs. Park wasn't the kind of person who would disappear without a word, so they filed a missing person report soon afterward. As the last person Mrs. Park had planned to meet before she disappeared, Professor Kang naturally came under suspicion. But he refused to cooperate, offering an explanation that sounded perfectly reasonable. The two of them were already fighting each other in court. So why would they meet at all? According to him, he'd never intended to see his wife that day. And he had an alibi that seemed almost impossible to challenge. He'd spent the entire day with members of his hiking club. After coming down from the mountain that evening, he stopped alone at a bar he regularly visited, and when police went to verify his story, the owner confirmed it exactly as Kang had described. If Mrs. Park had truly been killed that night, then on paper, Professor Kang simply had no time to commit the crime. On top of that, during the first round of investigation, police found no trace suggesting that the two had met at all. Mrs. Park's family, however, didn't have the patience to simply sit and wait. They printed and distributed 100,000 flyers across the country and even offered a reward of up to 100 million won for information. The search continued for 49 straight days, until the suitcase was discovered on the riverbank, and the estimated time of death given by forensic investigators matched the very night Mrs. Park had disappeared. The nature of the case changed instantly. The investigation was reopened from the beginning, and the man who had once been cleared of suspicion was placed back on the list. Police decided to return to the starting point of the husband's alibi, the bar. During his first statement, the bar owner had insisted that the professor arrived very early that night and stayed until well past midnight. On the surface, that timeline gave Kang such a wide window that there seemed to be nothing suspicious about it. Police finished taking the statement and left, and no one noticed that the moment the door closed behind them, the bar owner let out a long breath. What he didn't expect was that more than a month later the police would return. This time, they placed one fact directly in front of him. Mrs. Park was dead. The man turned pale. His eyes darted around the room, and he struggled to get his words out. Only after officers pressed him relentlessly did he finally tell the truth. Professor Kang had indeed come to the bar alone that night. but he'd arrived very late, at around 1:30 in the morning. After ordering a drink, he gave the owner a warning. If the police ever came asking questions, he was to say that Kang had arrived much earlier than he actually had. Later, when the bar owner heard that the professor's wife was missing, he'd more or less figured out what might have happened. But knowing who Kang was, and fearing that he himself might get dragged into trouble, he chose to stay silent. The alibi that had once seemed flawless had now lost its foundation. With that lead in hand, police poured their efforts into reconstructing Professor Kang's movements that night, widening the search area and extending the time frame of the surveillance footage they reviewed. Eventually, they found what they were looking for. Evidence showing that both Kang and Mrs. Park had appeared in the same area, one after the other. The last place Mrs. Park was seen was a hotel in Haeundae district on the very evening she'd gone to meet her husband. At 10:47 p.m., a nearby camera captured her image. Not long afterward, she moved beyond the camera's coverage and vanished. When investigators expanded the time frame further, another crucial image emerged. 40 minutes earlier, Professor Kang had also been in the area around that very same hotel. The problem became even clearer when investigators looked at the map. Professor Kang's home was in Mandeokdong, Buk District, on the eastern bank of the Nakdong River. Mrs. Park's body had been found near the Nakdong River estuary by Ilsuk Bridge, to the south. Haeundae, meanwhile, was located along the city's eastern coastline. From Kang's home to Haeundae was already about 15 kilometers as the crow flies, and roughly a 30-minute drive. So the question was simple. What was he doing driving that far, in the middle of the night? Police had enough reason to believe that he'd deliberately gone to Haeundae to meet his wife, and that this was precisely the part of his journey the false statement at the bar had been created to erase. It seemed as though the game was finally over, but when the evidence was placed in front of him, Professor Kang remained almost unbelievably calm. He glanced at the blurry surveillance footage and turned the question back on the investigators. What exactly were the police relying on to claim that the person in the video was him? And this was where things became truly unsettling. He was an expert. He knew exactly where the limits of visual evidence lay. As long as he refused to admit it was him, a grainy piece of surveillance footage alone couldn't convict anyone. Throughout the entire interrogation that day, he didn't leave a single opening. And yet, the moment he stepped out of the office, his body suddenly trembled, and his right hand reached out to brace against the wall. It lasted only a brief instant, but it was enough to convince the police that they were heading in the right direction. In cases like this, two things tend to tell the truth most clearly: cell phone location data and vehicle travel records. So when investigators finally reached Professor Kang's personal devices, everything became even more suspicious. His phone was brand new. The SIM card had also just been replaced, and the timing of that replacement fell exactly 1 day after his wife was reported missing. His computer had been formatted repeatedly, his browsing history had been wiped completely clean, and even his car had been sold to a used car dealership. Think about it. When a wife disappears for no known reason, no matter how cold the marriage has become, an ordinary husband doesn't usually go on a frantic campaign to destroy data. But sometimes, being too clever becomes its own mistake, because those very moves were practically screaming that something important had been hidden inside the information he erased. The problem is that there's a very common misunderstanding about digital data. People assume that deleting something from a phone means it's gone forever, when in reality, the opposite is often true. A cell phone is only the endpoint of a signal. A message you send has to pass through a cell tower before being routed to the carrier's servers, where records can remain. Location data works much the same way, because as long as the phone is powered on, the SIM card continues communicating with surrounding cell towers. In other words, the hardware can be replaced and the card can be destroyed, but the connection records can still remain inside the underlying system. He'd erased everything within his reach. So the police went looking somewhere his hands could not reach. Busan police dispatched their most skilled digital forensics team overnight to Seoul, heading straight for the headquarters of major telecommunications companies and social networking services. Before long, an urgent message came back to the command center. It turned out that Kang had forgotten one very basic fact. Every conversation has two ends. He'd wiped his side clean, but the records stored on the servers were still intact. And among them was a message he'd sent to someone else. It contained only one sentence. Make up your mind. Who had he sent it to? And what exactly was this person supposed to make up their mind about? Police immediately understood that the recipient of that message was the second doorway into the entire plot. The technical team traced the account, and one name emerged. Mrs. Choi. Also, 50 years old. The deeper investigators dug, the more a secret relationship stretching back years began to surface. The connection between the two had started as far back as 2004. At the time, Professor Kang's career was soaring, but his private life was falling apart. Trapped in his marriage, he often turned to alcohol. Because his work involved a great deal of entertaining, he regularly called for a designated driver. And on one particular occasion, the person who came to drive him home was Mrs. Choi. She was a good driver, spoke gently, and most importantly, she was willing to sit and listen while he poured out his frustrations. On paper, they were two people from completely different worlds. But inside the enclosed space of a car, during countless late-night rides home, something quietly began to grow. From then on, Mrs. Choi became his dedicated private driver. The two grew increasingly close, and over time, the relationship developed into an affair. Police believe Mrs. Choi knew far more than anyone had initially suspected, and may even have played a role in the plan targeting Mrs. Park. Officers rushed to her residence, only to find that she was gone. Immigration records showed that just days before the victim's body was recovered, Mrs. Choi seemed to sense that something was coming. She hurriedly boarded a flight to the United Arab Emirates and was still overseas. She even ignored messages from her own relatives and refused to respond. But there was one thing police were able to calculate. Her visa allowed her to remain there for less than a month. That meant she'd be forced to return by the end of May. A wanted notice was issued, and every sign of her possible return was closely monitored. Meanwhile, the technical team continued working non-stop for 3 days and 3 nights to recover the deleted data. In the end, they retrieved exactly what Professor Kang had tried to erase. Inside the interrogation room, he continued insisting that he'd never met his wife that day and hadn't contacted her at all. But the recovered data told a completely different story. The frequency of communication between the two that day was unusually high. And Kang himself had been the one who initiated the messages, asking his wife to meet and discuss the division of their property. That was also why a separated woman like Mrs. Park had been alone in Hyundai that night. Kang argued that the person seen on surveillance wasn't him. But the recovered cell tower location data showed that between 10 and 11 p.m., his phone signal remained in Hyundai. Police pointed out something else as well. At 11 p.m., Kang sent his wife his final message. Then, during the exact 10-minute period from 11:16 to 11:26 p.m., an acquaintance called him 3 times in a row, and he missed all 3 calls. So what was he doing during those 10 minutes that left him unable to answer the phone? In other words, that may very well have been the window in which he met his wife and prepared to make his move. And yet, Professor Kang still didn't flinch. He even criticized the officers' questioning as unprofessional, arguing that from a technical standpoint, sending a text message and making a phone call were 2 entirely different concepts. He admitted that he'd sent the message. But so what? His wife might never have read it. And the evidence available at that point showed only one thing: that the 2 of them had been in the same area. It did not prove that they'd actually met. The argument sounded airtight. Unfortunately for him, the police still had one more card to play. In the early hours of that morning, Mrs. Park's phone was switched off. But the location where it went dark wasn't in Hyundai. It was near Professor Kang's own residence, in Mandukdong Buk District. And more importantly, at that exact same time, the location data from his phone revealed that he was there as well. From that moment until the time he appeared at the bar, there was a full hour. More than enough time to do everything that needed to be done. Once those data points were placed where they belonged, like pieces of a puzzle, the picture of that night finally began to emerge. During the day, Professor Kang spent time with his hiking club as if nothing were wrong, laughing and talking with the other members. But during every break, he kept messaging his wife, acting as though he wanted to repay the money he owed her. Eventually, the two agreed to meet at 11 that night in Hyundai to discuss the division of their assets. At around 10 in the evening, Kang had already driven there and was waiting. More than 40 minutes later, Mrs. Park arrived by taxi near the area, got out, received a message from her husband, and walked toward him. The murder took place inside the car shortly after she got in. The weapon was a nylon cord. The vehicle then left Hyundai and headed west, cutting across the city toward Mandukdong, where the victim's phone was switched off in the early hours of the morning, severing the last thread tying her to this world. And at 1:30 a.m., Professor Kang walked into his usual bar, using both threats and persuasion to pressure the owner into giving false testimony and creating what appeared to be a perfect alibi along the timeline. But there was still one piece of the picture that didn't fit. From 1:30 a.m. onward, Kang was sitting inside the bar, in full view of a witness who would later testify for him. So, during that time, whose hands had carried that suitcase to the Nakdong River? Soon after Professor Kang was formally arrested, Mrs. Choi, after repeated urging from her family and realizing that she had nowhere left to run, finally chose to return to South Korea. Police had already been stationed at Incheon Airport for some time, so the moment she stepped off the plane, she was arrested. With both of them now in custody, the truth of the case finally began to come into full view. And what police discovered was that this had never been a spontaneous act. It had been a carefully prepared plan that had taken shape over the course of several months. From records recovered from Professor Kang's computer, police discovered that several months before the murder, he'd repeatedly searched for one specific phrase: how to kill someone without leaving a trace. In other words, the idea of killing his wife had been in his mind long before that night. To completely wash away any suspicion directed at himself, he turned to the person he trusted most, Mrs. Choi. The two divided their roles very clearly. Professor Kang was responsible for planning the strategy and choosing the timing, while Mrs. Choi handled the practical arrangements on the ground. Together, they repeatedly traveled down to Saha District in southern Busan to search for a place to dispose of the body, noting the locations of surveillance cameras along the route. In the end, they chose the Nakdong River estuary near Yulsuk Bridge, hoping the water would keep their secret buried beneath the surface forever. Surveillance footage also captured Professor Kang going to a store to purchase the travel suitcase, while Mrs. Choi went somewhere else to buy several additional items they needed. For security, Kang limited his face-to-face meetings with her and communicated mainly through text messages. Mrs. Choi knew exactly what that suitcase would be used for from the day it was purchased. She wasn't someone who'd been pulled into the crime halfway through. She'd been there from the very first page of the plan. In fact, Professor Kang had already decided to carry out the murder one day earlier. That day, he went to work at the university as usual and instructed Mrs. Choi to remain on standby near his home. His plan was to lure his wife to the university, get her into the car, and kill her there. But shortly before he was supposed to act, he realized that surveillance cameras were everywhere on campus and that the entire plan could easily be exposed. So he called it off. After thinking it through carefully, he decided that Hyundai, on the opposite side of the city, would be safer. He rarely went there himself, so he was certain no one would think to trace his movements in that area. On April 2nd, the two put their plan into motion. The meeting place Professor Kang chose to lure his wife to was the parking lot of a hotel in Hyundai, an area with no surveillance cameras at all. And this was where police had reconstructed the case incorrectly for months, because they'd always believed that only 2 people were in that parking lot that night. Mrs. Choi's statement showed otherwise. She hadn't been waiting at home for a phone call. She'd already been standing by nearby, exactly as they'd rehearsed the day before. Inside the car, both of them pulled the nylon cord tight around Mrs. Park's neck. Her body was then placed inside the suitcase, and this was the piece police had once placed in the wrong position. The car that drove back toward Mandiok that night wasn't going there to hide the body. It was going there to hand it over. Once there, Professor Kang switched off the victim's phone and transferred the suitcase into Mrs. Choi's vehicle. He then turned toward the bar. Mrs. Choi gripped the steering wheel and continued south alone through the night. While transporting the suitcase, Mrs. Choi did everything she could to avoid areas where visible surveillance cameras might capture her. And even though she was accidentally recorded in a few places, no one paid much attention. After all, she was a driver by profession and routinely drove all over the city. That was why, until Mrs. Park's body was finally recovered, no one realized the conspiracy the 2 of them had carried out. In the days that followed, the entire city was thrown into turmoil by Mrs. Park's disappearance. Yet Professor Kang remained completely calm. He even took the time to thoroughly clean the car used in the crime before selling it to a used car dealership, believing that this moving crime scene had permanently left his hands. What he didn't realize was that police had traced the sales records and recovered that very same vehicle. But even after his arrest, Professor Kang still didn't confess in the way police wanted him to. Instead, he chose a far more calculated retreat. He admitted that he'd been involved in his wife's death, but insisted that the killing had been an impulsive act rather than something premeditated. During the crime scene reenactment, he even said that he regretted not being able to hold back until the end, claiming that his wife had pushed him to that point. Mrs. Park's family was outraged when they heard those words, because they understood exactly what he was doing. Premeditated murder and a killing committed in the heat of the moment carried completely different sentencing consequences, and a man who understood the law knew exactly where he needed to position himself. Even then, he was still calculating. What finally brought those calculations to an end were 3 pieces of evidence, placed on the table one after another. The entire deleted conversation history, now fully recovered. Surveillance footage showing Kang himself buying the suitcase, and the news that Mrs. Choi had returned to South Korea. Only then did Professor Kang's testimony begin to change. On the other side, Mrs. Choi broke down far more quickly. Hoping for leniency, she confessed to the entire course of the crime, and the very conversations the 2 had personally tried to erase preserved the details in full. Before the murder, Professor Kang messaged her saying that he was on his way to buy the suitcase. She replied that she'd already reached the bridge and that they'd go back together that evening to check the area once more. After everything was over, he advised her to leave the country for a while and return only after things had cooled down. Throughout her time overseas, Mrs. Choi lived in constant fear that the truth would come out. Night after night, she could barely sleep, until she saw the news that the victim had been found, and whatever psychological defenses she had left finally collapsed. In the interrogation room, she covered her face and sobbed, admitting that ever since she'd met Professor Kang, she'd lived under his control and influence. At one point, she had even believed that helping him remove the obstacle in his path would be the final gift that proved the depth of their relationship. By this point, every attempt at justification had become pale and powerless. On one side was a highly educated intellectual, an expert in cybercrime who understood every gap in the law. On the other was his secret lover, who willingly stepped into the crime and believed that doing so was a way to prove her love. The 2 of them thought that by exploiting gaps in information and destroying physical evidence, they could deceive everyone. What they failed to understand was that the digital world has a memory, while traces left behind in the physical world can never be completely washed away. Not long afterward, the Busan District Prosecutor's Office formally indicted them both, and the once respected criminology expert who had stood before lecture halls now began facing the harshest judgment the law could impose. When the case was made public, it triggered a fierce wave of debate across society. The biggest question was this: why would a well-known expert in cybercrime, someone who understood the law, knowingly break it and take such an enormous risk to commit murder? The truth was much simpler than many people imagined. Professor Kang may have had an impressive reputation, but his private life was scandal-ridden. He spent heavily, and his financial situation was far more limited than it appeared. From the very beginning, his marriage to Mrs. Park had been tied to money. As the director of a successful private exam preparation academy in Busan, Mrs. Park had substantial financial resources, and after they married, she lent her husband more than 300 million won. But Kang didn't use that money for their life together. Instead, he used it to buy a house for his biological daughter, then repeatedly asked to borrow even more, causing the conflict between the couple to become increasingly obvious. And just as their financial dispute reached its breaking point, Mrs. Park discovered something else. The secret relationship between her husband and Mrs. Choi. It was the final straw. Furious, Mrs. Park demanded that Kang repay every won he had borrowed, including the original 300 million won, or she would take legal action. Unable to come up with the money, Professor Kang soon found himself facing a divorce lawsuit filed by his wife, while the financial pressure on him continued to grow. Mrs. Choi's later testimony exposed even more of his greed. Kang had once promised her that if his wife were to suddenly disappear, he would inherit a large estate. Then, he said, he could buy a home for Choi's child and open the cafe she had always dreamed of owning. At the same time, Professor Kang cared so deeply about his reputation that he regarded his image as a respected expert, almost as if it were his very life. He was the president of the Korean Society for Cybercrime Research, a position that demanded a spotless reputation, and what he feared most was that the divorce case would become a public scandal. If his wife aggressively pursued the lawsuit, a flood of damaging information could come to light. His hidden previous marriages, the money he had taken through deception, and the scandals in his private life. And if that happened, the image he'd spent years carefully building could collapse in an instant. And so he began to embrace a dream he called the perfect crime. He arrogantly believed that if he could simply make his wife disappear from the face of the earth, the police would eventually close the case as an ordinary missing person investigation. That way, he could escape his debts, preserve his career, and legally inherit her estate as her current husband. Before the murder, he'd even bragged more than once to people he knew that in the modern age, a perfect crime was entirely possible, and that if he personally decided to commit one, he would never be caught. Words like that were chilling to anyone who heard them, especially his own students. 6 months after the crime, the first trial opened at the Busan District Court, where both Professor Kang and Mrs. Choi were prosecuted on multiple charges, including murder and desecration of a corpse. Prosecutors argued that Kang hadn't merely committed a crime, but had used his own professional expertise in a way that seriously undermined the public interest, making the case exceptionally grave. They therefore called for severe punishment. After a period of trial proceedings, the court sentenced Kang to 30 years in prison. Choi was also convicted of murder as an accomplice, not merely as someone who had helped dispose of the body, and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The verdict immediately sent shockwaves through South Korea's legal community. And the reason it carried such historic significance was that it came at a turning point in the country's criminal justice system. 1 year before the murder, South Korea's National Assembly had passed an amendment to the Criminal Act. Before that, the country's sentencing framework had been relatively lenient, with the maximum fixed-term prison sentence set at only 15 years. Even with sentence enhancements for multiple serious offenses, the maximum was only 25 years. As public demands for harsher punishment of dangerous criminals grew louder, the law was significantly revised, doubling the maximum fixed-term sentence to 30 years. When multiple offenses were combined, the total sentence could reach as high as 50 years. In October of that same year, the revised law officially took effect. In other words, Professor Kang became one of the first people to cross that newly raised line after the new law went into force. What's especially notable is that prosecutors weren't asking for 30 years. They were asking for life imprisonment. And for a case involving only one victim, at a time when the new criminal law had been in effect for less than a year, a 30-year sentence was extremely severe. The message sent by the ruling was unmistakable. Intelligence and professional expertise are not shields against punishment. And when someone understands the law but chooses to break it anyway, that very knowledge can become a reason for harsher judgment. Of course, Kang refused to accept the verdict. He appealed, and the appellate court reduced his sentence from 30 years to 22. Mrs. Choi's sentence was also reduced from 10 years to 5. The Supreme Court later upheld those rulings, bringing the case to a close. 5 years later, Mrs. Choi completed her sentence and disappeared into the crowd, perhaps trying to forget everything that had happened. Professor Kang, meanwhile, remains behind prison walls to this day. There's one paradox this case reveals with remarkable clarity. The more skilled someone becomes in a particular field, the easier it is to believe they have accounted for everything. The problem was that Kang's plan had never been tested by anyone else, because in his mind, no one else was capable enough to test it, and what he believed he had created was the perfect crime. What about you? Do you believe there is such a thing as a perfect crime? Or are there only cold cases with the truth still lying somewhere in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered at another time? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching until the end. The thumbnail for the next case is on screen now, so click on it to keep watching.